Sunday Baroque Conversations is made possible by the Friends of Sunday Baroque and is produced at WSHU Public Radio in Fairfield, Connecticut. I'm Suzanne Bona. Thank you for listening. Don't miss an episode of Sunday Baroque Conversations. Subscribe on Apple or wherever you get your podcasts. And please leave us a review. If you want to find out where you can listen to our weekly show, visit our website, sundaybaroque.org, for a station list and our 24/7 stream. Again, that's sundaybaroque.org. Edward Klorman is a professional violist and a professor of music theory at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His research examines the intersections of music analysis, historical musicology, and music performance. Edward Klorman joins me on Zoom to talk about the Cello Suites by Johann Sebastian Bach and his new book about them. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So you are a violist. You're not a cellist. What is it about the Cello Suites by Bach that drew you in to even write this book?
That's a great question. I've been playing Bach's cello suites on viola about as long as I've been playing viola, actually even longer than that. My first studies in music were on Suzuki violin, and in some of the early Suzuki books, there are even music arranged from the cello suites. So this is music that a lot of string players live with and play on whichever instrument they prefer, from young childhood all the way throughout their whole careers. It's music that is endlessly challenging. The six suites each have a different personality. The solo violin pieces, the sonatas and partitas that Bach wrote, they're very explicit in the way they use polyphony, by which I mean Bach writes a lot of chords, a lot of double stops, so you're playing many notes at once and the violin fleshes out its texture. But when he wrote for the cello, he did a lot with implication. So you might hear one note that's in the melody, one note that's in the bass line, and in your mind as a listener or as a musician, you somehow connect them to imagine that there's more harmony, more counterpoint than the instrument's actually playing. So this is something that makes the music very rich and very demanding for us as performers and as listeners.
Yeah. And especially, it's a solo instrument. And so, I know exactly what you mean. That like it really does sort of flesh it out in a very unique way that you can do on a string instrument particularly well. There just seems to be something about Bach's music in general that is uniquely compelling, uniquely just something tantalizing for musicians, and not even just classical musicians. And so I wonder whether, this is sort of more of the 30,000-foot view of Bach in general, not necessarily specifically the cello suites, although you've articulated a really, great example of why those are so compelling. But do you have any theories about what it is about Bach that is so compelling to jazz musicians and folk musicians and rap musicians even, and in addition to classical musicians? You have any theories on that?
It's a great question. There's famous recordings by musicians like Nina Simone, playing her own original music. And in the middle of it, there's, a fugue that she improvises that's in the style of Bach. It tells you the role that this music had in so many musicians' lives. I think for a lot of us, it's foundational. It's part of what we think about with learning how to play our instruments and learning how music is put together, learning how voices combine to build textures. And for many of us, we just live with it throughout our lives. I think that's true for a lot of listeners also. There might be pieces you're used to hearing at certain times of the year, maybe at church, or every year you go to hear a concert, and you might hear the St. Matthew Passion or something like this. So it's music we've returned to that comes to have meanings for us. In my research on the Bach cello suites, I've been interested to see just how many artists in different genres have made use, especially of the prelude to the first cello suite. That's the prelude in G major. I learned that on Reddit, people refer to it as that cello song. And when they're writing about that cello song, they made the prelude from the Bach G major cello suite. But it's been used in many movies, ranging from Master and Commander, where it represents the sea, to this Tony Scott horror film, The Hunger, where David Bowie plays a vampire who's a cellist, to sillier movies like The Hangover 2. People have covered them in a number of different genres, including Japanese pop music, including Latin jazz. They've played them on every which kind of instrument. I mean, not just, I play them on viola, but people play them on marimba, banjo, and it's just remarkable to me how endlessly adaptable and inspiring this music is for so many people.
Yeah. And I think sometimes too people are surprised that, Bach was in many ways kind of a rock star, of his day. And the family was certainly, a family of rock stars. And yet that kind of fell out of fashion for a while after his lifetime. He was sort of like old fashioned or, not really, they moved on to other things, post Bach, if you will. And his music wasn't necessarily played much, and that includes the cello suite. So, how did that all come about? I mean, we know that the St. Matthew Passion sort of was reinvigorated, if you will, by Sarah Levy and who was Mendelssohn's great aunt, I guess. But what about the cello suites? How did those sort of become a little bit more of interest to people after this dearth of interest in Bach?
It can be hard to imagine that some of this music that today is so iconic and beloved and that is seen as so foundational was at one time very little known. So, for example, just a few years after Bach died, one of his sons, C.P.E. Bach, and one of his former students, someone named Agricola, they co-authored an obituary, and the obituary describes him as an acclaimed organist. But it also gives a list of the music that he composed, and this is kind of the foundation of his first works list. And it mentions some of the extraordinary choral music, the passions, the cantatas, pieces like the Well-Tempered Clavier, and then at the very end it mentions six pieces for violin alone. That's the sonatas and partitas, and six of the same for cello. That's the cello suites. And then they say, and a whole bunch of other pieces for every which combination and instrument you can mention. So this is interesting to me that they mostly wrote about his choral music and then his keyboard music, but the only pieces that were, aside from those that were singled out for special mention, were the unaccompanied violin and the unaccompanied cello pieces. That tells me that in Bach's immediate circle, so within his family and with his students, he must have considered these to be extraordinary pieces. They must have been pieces that he worked on with his students. And so people who became interested or became a part of the Bach revival, who circulated manuscript copies of these pieces, they knew of these pieces, but many people couldn't access them. So one thing I found in my research is maybe around 1800, 1810, there are some sources that mention that these pieces exist, but the people writing them, it's not clear they've ever heard them or ever seen them. And so the first published edition of the Bach cello suites, it's published in 1824. That's a century after these pieces are written. But we don't know if anybody actually played them. There's actually only one copy of this edition that survives that says that it probably didn't circulate so much. But starting around 1860, we have a lot of evidence of performances. People say, oh, this cellist gave a recital and included one saraband by Bach, and it's a very strange piece. So a lot of the critics weren't sure that this music for just cello alone, it seems so spare. This music seemed to some listeners almost like etudes. And so some
Mm.
critics would write, is this really suitable for a concert? Or is this maybe meant to be more to learn to play the cello? So people really wondered what to make of these pieces.
Hmm. What were some of the surprises that you encountered when you were researching and writing this book?
Well, some of these first performances, that was super interesting to learn about them. I had always been led to believe that these pieces were hardly known until Pablo Casals began touring them and then recorded his world premiere recording of the whole
Hmm.
cycle in the late 1930s. But I found that there were quite a lot of performances starting from about 1860 in Germany, in France, in England, but even as far afield as Australia was really
Oh,
interesting. And you can read the critics' reviews of these concerts, which range from I don't know what to make of this to oh well, this music sounds a lot better if you add piano accompaniment. So that was a really big tradition that started around that time and lasted as late as the 1920s. There
wow.
are recordings you can hear on YouTube that give you a clue into how these pieces might have been heard by some of their first audiences. So that was very interesting. Another angle was just following these pieces around the world. So, starting in the 1940s, there was a trend where some musicians thought, well, I should learn all six cello suites and play them in a series of subscription concerts. So, these would be for really, serious listeners to come hear two or three concerts in a row and hear the entire cycle. When critics, again, were divided, is this a good concert program? Is this interesting or not? But some really said, well, this is some of the greatest music ever written for cello, or it's a great act of artistic bravery to perform this music in this way.
Mhm.
Around the same time, you have people reviving some historical practices. So, for example, The sixth cello suite is written for a five-string instrument. So a normal, typical cello has four strings, but Bach expanded the range of the instrument. It allows for it to get much brighter, much more virtuosic. Different kinds of chords are possible. And so there were musicians in the early 20th century who commissioned instruments trying to figure out what this might have sounded like originally. It's just one thing that I've traced is just in every generation, musicians inventing and reinventing new kinds of ways this music can sound and different spins that they can bring to it, whether it's a change in the instrument they use, the tempos, the fingerings, always a constant reinvention.
Mm. And to your point, I mean, the great cellist Janos Starker recorded them, I think, five times over the course of his
Yes.
career. Yo-Yo Ma, a couple of years ago, made his third and what he says will be his final recording of them. But of course, now he is also there's sort of his, I don't want to say signature piece, but they really have become sort of really deeply identified with him. He performs them all over the world. I know that in COVID time, he went and got his vaccination and spent that 15 minutes post-vaccination playing the cello suites for the other people at the vaccine clinic. He's Yo-Yo Ma has sort of his take on the cello suites at this point seems to be as a unifying factor, as something to encourage peace and bring healing and that sort of thing. So, how can this music? I mean, how can it embody so much?
That's a great question. I think, well, first of all, since Pablo Casals really touted these pieces and established them as being the cornerstone of the cello repertoire, I think there's now this sense that if you're a world touring, concertizing cellist, this is music to grapple with and to make part of your repertoire, music that you teach, music that you play on almost a daily basis throughout your life. So any really serious cellist at that level is going to make a recording of all six cello suites. And some cellists will do it more than once, like you said, because after a decade or two, you might think about them in a different way, or you think you can bring a different angle to them. Some people might play them on a different kind of instrument. I'm thinking of the cellist Matt Heimovitz, who recorded them on a cello in modern setup, and more recently on a cello in a Baroque setup and with a Baroque bow. One inspiration, I think, from Casals that's affected many musicians is, Casals, when Franco came to power in Spain, he fled the country and refused to perform in any country that recognized Spain. So that was most of the world. So it was seen as a great sacrifice in the name of his anti-fascist values. And I think of cellists like Yo-Yo Ma, besides having played them as you said, for care workers during COVID. He's also performed them, for instance, at the US-Mexico border, outside the Russian embassy. There was that viral video early in the war in Ukraine with the cellist from Kharkiv playing the C minor cello suite. That became a viral video. Rostropovich playing the cello suites just after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Many cellists have used this music as a kind of appeal to a broad international humanity, pro peace, as a kind of a human heritage that transcends boundaries of time or nationality.
Right. Or even genre, like we were saying, so
Yes.
many different people. You said something a couple of minutes ago, and I really want to build on this and ask you, probe this a little bit more. You said each suite has a different personality. I'm dying to know, what are some of your personal favorites of the suites, whether it's the suite itself or movements from the suites, and what are some of the moments and things that stand out? Let's hear about what those unique personality traits are of each of the suites, if you will.
Yeah, it's very interesting to think about the six suites as a cycle. It was very common in Bach's lifetime to publish compositions in groups of six. So, for example, there are six Brandenburg Concerti, there's six pieces for unaccompanied violin, the sonatas and partitas, there's six cello suites. One thing that's unusual about the cello suites is they become more complex, even just simply more technically difficult to perform over the course of the cycle. So you get the sense that Bach wanted to challenge himself everything that could be possible with the spareness of just a single instrument. The violin, which was an instrument, he played very masterfully. It's easier to play chords and difficult left hand material than it is on the cello. So I think he set for himself the challenge of how can you make the cello, how much can you make with such limited resources? So, cello suite number one in G major, that emphasizes the open G string, the open D string. There's a section with the open A string. There's a fermata, a hold on the low open C string, the lowest note on the cello. So it's almost like introducing the cello in its most natural, most resonant, form.
Mhm.
Then you get to cello suite number 4. That's an E flat major. So that's a key where the tonic, the subdominant, and dominant notes, none of them are open strings. So open strings, these are the most resonant notes on the cello. If you play a chord and 2 of the notes are open strings, those are the warmest, most resonant kinds of chords you can make. Those chords aren't possible in the key of E flat major. So it's a lot harder for the cellist to find the right intonation, to get the instrument to ring. But it also makes the cello sound in a different way. Then cello suite number 5, this Bach wrote for a scordatura cello. That means if a cello is typically tuned in fifths, C, G, D, A. For this piece, you tune the A string down a step to G. So the instrument rings differently. It has a darker sound. The player has to learn how to play different combinations that aren't what they're used to. This is a particularly dark piece. It's one of only 2 of the cello suites in a minor key. There's a tradition, many people have suggested that the piece might have something to do with crucifixion. This isn't an idea that comes from Bach directly, but I think what folks might be responding to in particular, the Saraband from that piece, it's very solemn movement with not a single double stop.
Mm.
And the harmony is very obscure because you never get anything that resembles chords. So if you're hearing harmony, you're hearing it in your imagination. It has this very plaintive sound to it. And then finally, to wrap up the set, you have this piece in D major, a very bright key. Bach wrote it for a 5-string cello. Most people today play it on a standard 4-string cello. That means to play the notes that would have been on the high E string, you're really stretching to get to the highest part of the cello. It's very virtuosic and brilliant. Technically, it's very challenging to do, but some folks imagine after you hear Suite 5 and its spare, dark quality, Suite number 6 with its brilliance, there can be a quality that might have something to do with the idea of resurrection. Certainly something very joyful and life-giving.
Mm. Mm. Do you have a favorite of the suites? As a
Oh,
player or a listener?
whichever one I'm playing is my favorite, but they each have different challenges for sure.
Yeah, yeah. And how does that challenge translate when you're playing them on the viola?
Well, I mostly listen to them on cello because that's mostly who plays it. So then on viola, I'm always wondering how can I make my instrument ring as much as a larger instrument. I myself play on 2 kinds of violas. I play on modern viola and also on Baroque viola, so they each respond in different ways. The modern bow is designed to sustain and to play with louder volume, to play in a more connected or singing way, whereas the Baroque bow has a kind of a heavier frog and a lighter tip, so you get this more dee-dum, bottom, bottom, this more kind of spoken or clipped sort of way. Sometimes things I learned from my Baroque bow I can imitate on my modern bow as well. Um, but yeah, I feel, Bach transcribed a lot of his music for different combinations. So, for example, for the solo violin pieces, the prelude in E major also exists in an orchestral version that was written as sort of like a symphony for one of his cantatas. And so you hear that version. There's trumpets and there's percussion, and you think, well, gee, can I imitate some of the excitement that you have in this version, some of its brilliance, when I bring it to the solo violin?
Mhm.
I think he was really interested in what each instrument's particular personality was and how one can find inspiration in the other. The 5th cello suite exists in a version for unaccompanied lute that Bach made in his own handwriting, we can see. And he changed the key and he made other adaptations to make it more suitable for the lute. So that can give us inspiration that we might think about on cello or on viola as well.
Yeah, yeah. And this is, of course, this is the genius behind Bach, right? His
One
ability to
thing
be
I
so
was able
versatile.
to dig up in my research is actually there was a performance on viola as early as the 1860s. So
Mm.
one of the arrangers who had made a piano accompaniment, he had this series where he performed them on organ with trombone and then on organ with viola. And the critics said, well, the viola played with this elegiac sound that was even more affecting than the cello might have been. So that
Wow.
was interesting. The history on viola goes even further back than I realized.
Wow. So much for all those viola jokes, right?
That's right.
Well, this is really fascinating. I have been speaking on Zoom with violist, music professor, and author Edward Klorman about his 2025 book, Bach, The Cello Suites. Congratulations and thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to speak with you.